stop. Before you go any further, I need to know who you are. If you are currently planning a wedding, if you are writing love letters at midnight, if the word soulmate exits your mouth without irony, close this video. This is not for you. You are still inside the dream, and the dream is beautiful. And I will not be the one to burn it down for you today. But if you have sat across from a lawyer and watched a decade of your life get divided into spreadsheet line items, if you handed over your apartment, your savings account, your future, and she handed over nothing but her lawyer's invoice, if you have been told in the language of the court that the love you once believed in was legally her property all along, then stay. Because what I am about to tell you is not a complaint. It is not bitterness dressed up as philosophy. It is an autopsy. And the body on the table is the institution you were told was the highest achievement of a man's life. You think marriage is a romantic institution, a covenant between two souls, the natural conclusion of love. That is the most successful piece of propaganda in the history of Western civilization. Machiavelli, writing in The Prince, made a point that no one applies to their personal life, though they should. He warned, a prince must not make himself hated, and nothing makes him more hated than seizing the property of his subjects. Read that again. Property, seizure, hatred. Now ask yourself, what is the one legal mechanism in modern Western society by which a man can lose his property, his home, his business, and his future income? Not through crime, not through bankruptcy, but through an act he performed voluntarily, publicly, and with joy, while dressed in his finest suit? The answer is the marriage contract. Machiavelli was not describing ancient tyranny. He was describing the architecture of control, and the marriage institution is the most elegant expression of that architecture ever devised. Because the prince does not seize your property, you surrender it, willingly, at an altar, in front of witnesses, while a song plays. That is not love. That is a masterclass in statecraft. This did not happen by accident. It happened by design, and the blueprint was laid 2,000 years ago. In 18 BC, Emperor Augustus passed the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus. He was not concerned with love. He was not concerned with happiness. He was concerned with one thing: the declining birth rate of Roman citizens, which was threatening the supply of soldiers and taxpayers the empire needed to survive. He made marriage legally mandatory for men of certain ages. He taxed bachelors. He penalized childless couples. He incentivized fertility with inheritance rights. Augustus did not ask Roman men if they wanted families. He built a legal architecture that made staying single economically punishing and socially shameful. And here is the part they do not teach in school. It worked. Not because Roman men suddenly discovered love, but because compliance was cheaper than resistance. The empire needed a mechanism to convert wild, ambitious, mobile, dangerous men into stationary, predictable, domesticated ones. Men who owned property, men who had children to protect, men who had too much to lose to ever consider revolt. A man with nothing to lose is ungovernable. A man with a mortgage, 2 children, and a joint bank account is the easiest creature on earth to manage. The wedding ring was never a crown. It was a brand mark. The ceremony was never a celebration. It was the moment the drawbridge rose and you were inside the castle, and you no longer noticed that castles are also prisons. But none of this would work without the anesthetic. You cannot ask a man to walk into a cage. He will refuse. He has instincts. He has self-preservation. So you do not ask him. You intoxicate him first. Love, the romantic love you have been sold since childhood, is the most precisely engineered compliance mechanism in human history. It does not arrive by accident. It arrives through culture, through film, through music, through every story you absorbed before you were old enough to question it. The knight rescues the princess. The hero gets the girl. The man who does not pursue love is defective, broken, less than. By the time a man is 25, he has consumed 10,000 hours of romantic programming. His brain has been rewired to associate his own worth with the acquisition of a woman's approval. This is not an accident of culture. This is curation. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who understood power better than almost anyone in modern European history, contracted 2 strategic marriages, neither of which he entered for love. He wrote plainly, "In politics, absurdity is not a handicap." He understood that the emotional performances of public life, the coronation, the marriage, the celebration, were theater designed to manage perception. He used marriage as a tool of geopolitical alliance. He discarded Josephine with surgical coldness when she failed to produce an heir. That is, when she failed her political function. Napoleon did not hate Josephine. He understood the nature of institutions. He knew that a marriage is a treaty, and treaties are only honored as long as they serve the interests of both parties. The question no one asks you before you sign the contract is, when her interests change, what happens to yours? Let us be precise about the mechanism. In medieval Europe, the lord did not need to steal from the serf directly. He built the system so that the serf's labor, the serf's produce, and eventually the serf's children belonged to the estate by default. The serf did not experience this as theft. He experienced it as the natural order of things. The modern marriage contract operates on identical logic. From the moment the contract is signed, your financial future is no longer fully your own. Your income becomes a shared resource. Your assets become marital property. Your business, built before she arrived, becomes subject to division. Your retirement savings, accumulated through years of sacrifice, becomes negotiable. And, if the treaty breaks down, which statistically it does in more than 40% of Western marriages, the dissolution process does not divide assets based on who created them. It divides them based on a legal framework written by the state, administered by the court, and enforced by mechanisms that answer to institutions, not to you. Machiavelli warned that the prince who ignites the hatred of his people cannot survive, no matter how strong his armies. The genius of the modern system is that it does not ignite your hatred. It never appears as an enemy. It appears as a form you sign with a smile, surrounded by flowers, while people applaud. When the same system later extracts from you everything you built, you do not feel like you were robbed by the state. You feel like you made a personal mistake. You blame yourself. You blame her. You never question the architecture of the room you were standing in. That is not misfortune. That is precision engineering. There is an image I want you to hold. In ancient Rome, military commanders who achieved great victories were granted a triumph, a procession through the city, crowds cheering, glory absolute. But inside the general's chariot, standing behind him, was a slave whose sole function was to whisper in his ear, continuously, "Memento mori, remember, you will die. Remember, you are mortal." The triumph was real. The glory was real. And the cage was built directly into the celebration. This is marriage. The ceremony is real. The love, at that moment, is real. The feeling of arrival, of completion, of finally having become the man who has everything, that is real. And built directly into that celebration is the contractual framework that will govern the extraction of everything you have built, should the love ever end. You cannot see the cage because it is made of gold. And gold is the material human beings most reliably fail to recognize as a trap. Machiavelli did not advise men to become cold or loveless. He advised them to see clearly. He wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Apply this to your own life. Look at the contracts you have signed. Look at the institutions you have trusted blindly. Look at the legal framework you entered voluntarily, without reading, because the music was playing and she looked beautiful. A man who has read The Prince does not sign treaties without understanding the terms of dissolution. He does not surrender his financial sovereignty because he is told it is romantic to do so. He does not allow his identity, his ambition, and his assets to become legally entangled with another party's interests, without understanding what happens when those interests diverge. This is not cynicism. This is literacy. It is the difference between a statesman and a pawn. The pawn does not know he is on a board. He thinks he is in a love story. The statesman knows exactly what game is being played, and he decides, with full information, how to move. You came here thinking this was about a bad relationship, a difficult woman, a painful breakup. It was never that small. This is about the system that shaped the room you were standing in before you ever met her. The architecture was older than your parents' marriage, older than your grandparents'. It was built by emperors who needed soldiers to stop being dangerous, by states that needed men to stop being mobile, by capital that needed consumers to stop being free. You were not unlucky in love. You were a man who walked into a room without a map. Now you have the map. What you do with it, that is the only question left. If this cracked something open in you, understand that what I have shown you today is the surface. The deeper architecture, the psychological mechanisms that make intelligent men walk willingly into these structures, the tactical frameworks for building power without surrendering sovereignty, the dark patterns of social contract that no algorithm will allow me to discuss in full on a public channel, that exists behind the join button. Most men will not click it. They are not ready to stop being managed. But you are still here, which means you might be.